Oh no! My bread is covered with mould. I have nothing for breakfast.
Tim notices that the bread is covered with mold and he wants to find out its cause. He can carry out a scientific investigation. In fact, scientists generate scientific knowledge by conducting scientific investigations. Let us learn about what a scientific investigation is through the following example. In the past, a horrible disease called childbed fever killed many women who had just given birth to their babies. Semmelweis was a doctor working in a hospital in Vienna. The hospital had two maternity wards. The first ward was staffed with medical students and the second ward with midwives. Semmelweis noticed that more women had died of childbed fever in the first ward than in the second ward. He asked himself these questions.
What causes the difference in death rate between the two wards? Why do so many women die from childbed fever?
Later, he found that the medical students often dissected dead bodies and then went straight to deliver a baby without washing their hands.
I think the medical students have carried the agent of childbed fever on their hands, from the dead bodies to the women in the first ward.
To test his idea, he asked the medical students to wash their hands before delivering a baby. Within a few months, the number of deaths in the first ward dropped to a very low level. The above historical example shows how scientific knowledge is generated. Semmelweis had used a scientific method to study the cause of childbed fever. This method consists of the following key steps. Step 1. Making observations. Semmelweis observed more women in the first ward died from childbed fever than in the second ward. He also observed the medical students went straight to deliver a baby after dissecting dead bodies. Step 2. Asking a question. Semmelweis asked why was there a difference in the number of deaths between the two wards. Step 3. Suggesting a possible explanation, or a hypothesis. Semmelweis suggested that the medical students carried the agent of childbed fever on their hands from the dead bodies to the women in the first ward. Step 4. Testing the hypothesis. Semmelweis instructed the medical students to wash their hands before delivering a baby. If Semmelweis's hypothesis was correct, the number of deaths in the first ward would be reduced. Step 5. Drawing a conclusion. Based on the results of the test, Semmelweis concluded that childbed fever was caused by a substance present in dead bodies. In general, scientific knowledge is generated through systematic observation, experimentation and analysis. These processes require imagination and creativity. Let us now apply the method of science to solve Tim's problem. Tim notices that the bread is covered with mold after keeping it inside a cupboard for several days. Tim asks a question.
Where does the mould come from?
Tim suggests a hypothesis.
I think the bread turns mouldy in the dark.
Tim carries out an experiment to test the hypothesis.
If my hypothesis is correct, mould would appear only on the bread kept inside the cupboard, but not on the bread outside the cupboard.
After 4 days, mold appears on both pieces of bread. Since the result does not agree with the predictions made from the hypothesis, Tim draws a conclusion.
The hypothesis, bread turns mouldy in the dark, is incorrect.
Tim comes up with another hypothesis.
Ah, maybe the mould comes from the air.
Scientists usually perform experiments to test their hypotheses. Sometimes, however, it may not be able to perform experiments, such as in geology and astronomy. In such cases, scientists will look for observations that can be predicted from a hypothesis. If the actual observations agree with the prediction, the hypothesis is supported. On the other hand, if the actual observations do not agree with the prediction, the hypothesis has to be revised or rejected. Let us have a whole picture of the key steps in a scientific investigation. Step 1, making observations. Step 2, asking a question. Step 3, suggesting a hypothesis. Step 4, testing the hypothesis. Step 5, drawing a conclusion.